A wealthy man trailed a little beggar girl who had had the audacity to steal from him. On a crowded city street, the late afternoon sun blazed mercilessly overhead. Yet, Brian Russell walked briskly, unfazed, as if the heat dared not touch him. His impeccably tailored suit and glinting luxury watch were unmistakable symbols of the empire he had meticulously built, often at the expense of those who dared to stand in his way. At 45, his prematurely silver hair and eyes like shards of ice commanded an aura that was equal parts respect and fear wherever he went. He was just reaching for his phone to make an important call when a slight bump interrupted his stride. Initially, he dismissed it. The street was bustling, after all. But as his hand brushed his suit pocket, his expression darkened. His wallet was gone. Spinning around, his movements as swift and precise as a predator's, his sharp gaze locked onto a small figure darting away through the crowd. "Stop right there, thief," he thundered, his voice cutting through the urban din like a knife. Heads turned, and pedestrians froze in curiosity and alarm. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The girl, as quick as a startled cat, slipped further into the throng, weaving nimbly through the chaos. A child, he realized, his indignation morphing swiftly into an unrelenting fury. A child had dared to rob him. Wounded pride quickly festered into a simmering rage. Adjusting his silk tie with a trembling hand, Brian smirked, his thoughts growing darker. The police? Unnecessary. That would be far too simple. Not a chance, he growled under his breath. "You're mine now, little rat," he bellowed, surging into the chase. The street erupted in chaos as people moved aside, alarmed by the imposing man storming after the small figure. Vendors hastily pulled their wares out of the way, while the girl dashed past, toppling crates and scattering goods in her wake. Brian plowed through the debris without so much as a glance, his piercing gaze fixed on her slight form. "Run while you can," he murmured, his voice low and cold. "The farther you go, the harder your lesson will be." Years of boxing at an exclusive club had honed his endurance, and Brian pressed on with a steady, relentless rhythm. His breathing remained calm, his resolve unwavering. Each fleeting glance the girl cast over her shoulder revealed growing panic in her wide, frightened eyes. "Don't bother trying to escape," he taunted, his voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "I could do this all day, you little street rat." The chase led them into increasingly narrow alleyways, thick with the pungent aromas of food and the relentless buzz of city life sensations Brian found thoroughly distasteful. Desperation fueled the girl's attempts to slow him down. She overturned boxes and sent trash cans tumbling into his path. But Brian, with the agility of a predator, vaulted over the obstacles with ease. Pathetic, he sneered to himself, his cold eyes narrowing. Your tricks are nothing but a delay of the inevitable sweat dampened his finely pressed shirt, but he refused to relent. The girl's pace faltered, exhaustion was creeping in. Getting tired, are we? He called out, his mocking voice reverberating off the narrow walls. You won't last much longer, little thief. As they ventured deeper into the labyrinth of alleys, the vibrant city sounds began to fade, replaced by the suffocating quiet of dim, enclosed spaces. Brian could feel the trap tightening, each step drawing her closer to an inescapable end. She's cornered, he thought, satisfaction curling his lips as the girl hesitated at a fork in the path. Her movements, once swift and graceful, were now clumsy, her panic palpable. Brian's pace remained deliberate, savoring the power he held over her. Look at her, he mused, his grin darkening. Quaking like a trapped animal. No one takes from Brian Russell and gets away with it. The girl dashed into a shadowed alley, her frantic steps echoing against the damp walls. Her tattered sandals slapped against the ground as she searched desperately for an escape. Typical, Brian thought, pausing at the entrance. And utterly foolish. You've run yourself into a dead end. Calmly, he adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his expression betraying neither exhaustion nor hesitation. His gaze pierced the shadows ahead, his voice a menacing murmur. Let's see how long you'll last in the dark, little thief. After today, you'll regret the moment you crossed me. Brian Russell entered the alley with deliberate, measured steps, his polished shoes echoing ominously against the cracked pavement. The narrow passage was cloaked in dim light, faint rays filtering through the gaps between the buildings, casting jagged shadows on the damp walls. The stench of rotting garbage and mildew hung thick in the air, but it didn't faze him. To Brian, it was merely the backdrop for his twisted pursuit of retribution. "I can hear you breathing. Little thief," he called out, his voice slicing through the suffocating silence like a blade. "Your heart must be pounding, as loud as the coins you stole from me." His sharp ears caught the faint rustling of bills and the telltale clink of coins ahead. Moving closer, he spotted the girl crouched behind a rusted trash bin, her small frame hunched over a pile of stolen cash. "What a sight," he sneered, his lips curling into a cruel grin. "Counting your spoils like a rat scavenging for crumbs." Mia Collins froze at the sound of his voice, her fingers halting mid-count. The crumpled bills trembled in her grasp as her dirt-streaked face lifted, her wide, terrified eyes meeting his cold, steely gaze. Sweat slid down her cheeks, mixing with the grime that marked her desperation. "Please, sir," she stammered, her voice barely audible, breaking under the weight of her fear. I didn't mean to. I just needed to." Brian's laugh cut her off, a sharp, heartless sound that ricocheted off the alley's brick walls. He stepped forward, his towering frame casting an oppressive shadow over her. "Do you have any idea," he taunted, "how much this suit costs? The one you dared to touch with those filthy hands." Straightening his cuffs, he continued, "It's worth more than you could ever dream of stealing in your entire life." Desperation gripped Mia. She made a frantic attempt to dart past him, her small legs propelling her forward like a frightened deer. But the cracked pavement betrayed her. "No, no," she cried as her foot caught in a jagged hole. She fell hard, the impact ripping her threadbare clothes and scraping her knees raw. Blood seeped through the fabric, staining the ground beneath her. "Get up," her mind screamed. "You have to run," but the pain flared, sharp and unrelenting, rooting her in place. Brian approached slowly, savoring the moment, his every step deliberate and mocking. "How pathetic," he sneered. "I thought street rats were supposed to be faster." Mia tried to crawl, her trembling hands smearing blood and grime as she dragged herself forward. "Please, sir," she begged, tears streaming down her face, carving clean trails through the dirt. "I can explain." The sleek leather wallet lay a few feet away, its contents scattered. Brian stooped to collect his belongings, his movements calm and methodical. He didn't take his eyes off Mia, the cornered child who now embodied the very desperation she claimed. "Explain," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "Go ahead, tell me why you thought you could steal from me, Brian Russell. This should be entertaining." The faint wail of sirens pierced the stillness, making Mia shrink further into herself. Her sobs mixed with the distant noise of the city, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't call the police," she pleaded, her words trembling. "My mom. She's dying." Brian's steps faltered, his brow furrowed in both skepticism and intrigue. He studied her tear-streaked face, the sincerity in her trembling voice chipping away at his hardened exterior. "A sob story," he said, his sarcasm sharp. "Really? You think that will work on me? Do you honestly expect me to believe it?" Gathering the last of her strength, Mia raised her tear-filled eyes to meet his. Her small fists clenched, her knuckles white. "It's not a lie," she said, her voice breaking but resolute. "She needs medicine. I had no choice." Brian adjusted his silk tie a habitual motion, though it betrayed his unease. Her raw cries echoed in the narrow alley, piercing his composed demeanor. "Why should I believe you?" he demanded, his voice still cold but tinged with uncertainty. "Why not rob a pharmacy?" The sirens grew louder, amplifying Mia's visible panic. Blood dripped steadily from her wounded knee, pooling on the filthy ground. Her small frame pressed tighter against the wall, as though trying to disappear. "Please, Mr. Russell," she whispered, her words trembling. "The medication costs a fortune. Without it, she'll die. I'd do anything for her. I know stealing is wrong, but losing her," her voice cracked, and she choked on a sob. "I can't lose her." Her anguish hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Brian found himself wavering. Her desperation so raw, so genuine, stirred something unfamiliar in him. He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her completely. "So, little thief," he said, his voice low and measured, "why shouldn't I turn you in right now?" Mia lifted her tear-stained face, her gaze locking with his one final time. Her trembling body seemed impossibly small against the dark backdrop of the alley. "If I go to jail," she whispered, her voice faint but steady, "there'll be no one left for her. She has no one but me." Brian stood still, his sharp gaze taking in every detail, the blood pooling beneath her, the trembling of her fragile hands, and the pleading in her dark, pain-filled eyes. Something inside him shifted, a crack in the wall of his indifference. "Prove it," he said finally, his tone unyielding. "Show me you're telling the truth, or I'll make the call." Struggling to her feet, Mia wiped the grime and tears from her face. Her voice trembled, but her determination shone through. "I will," she said, meeting his icy gaze. "I'll show you everything." "My mom, she has no one but me." Brian Russell stood still, his sharp eyes fixed on the trembling girl before him. Every movement she made, every shiver, pulled at something deep within him that he didn't recognize. Blood trickled from Mia Collins' scraped knee, pooling on the grimy ground. Yet, it wasn't the physical sight that struck him, it was her voice, helpless, raw with despair, that lingered in his thoughts. He wasn't unfamiliar with lies, but something about her anguish felt disturbingly genuine. "Prove it," he said at last, his tone cold and unyielding. "Prove you're telling the truth, or I'll call the cops." Mia swallowed hard, her breath hitching as she tried to steady herself. Her small, dirt-streaked hands wiped at her tear-stained face. Wincing, she attempted to stand, stifling a cry as her weight pressed against her injured leg. "My name is Mia," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can show you. Come with me." Brian chuckled humorlessly, adjusting the sleek watch on his wrist, a practiced motion, masking his impatience. Following a street child through darkened alleys seemed absurd. Yet something in her resolve, in the way she said her name, struck a chord. "If this is some kind of setup," he warned, his voice menacing, "you'll wish the police had been the ones to catch you." With that, Mia limped toward the edge of the alley, each painful step a testament to her stubborn determination. Blood seeped from her knee, leaving a dark trail on the pavement as she pushed forward. Her small frame seemed impossibly fragile against the heavy shadows. "It's not far," she muttered, half to herself. "Hang on, Mom, I'm coming back." As they ventured deeper into the neighborhood, the surroundings grew progressively more dilapidated. Crumbling buildings with shattered windows lined littered sidewalks. Brian scanned the scene with a rising unease. His tailored suit and polished shoes felt like glaring symbols of a world far removed from the one unfolding before him. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked, his voice tinged with irritation and an undercurrent of concern. "This doesn't look like the kind of place where you'd find expensive medicine." Mia stopped in front of a small, dimly lit pharmacy. Through the dusty glass windows, sparse shelves barely held an assortment of goods. Her hands trembled as she pointed. "In there," she whispered. "That's where it is. The meds, they're so expensive. She needs 3 boxes every month, and I couldn't." Her voice faltered, her courage waning. The shop was as bleak inside as its exterior suggested, its dim lighting casting long shadows across mismatched shelves coated in dust. A weary pharmacist glanced up at Mia, his gaze narrowing at her torn clothes and scraped knee. "My mom's medicine," she began, her voice breaking. 3 boxes of the—" "I'll take care of it," Brian interrupted, already pulling out his wallet. He flipped through a thick stack of crisp bills, catching the wide-eyed look of the pharmacist. Mia stood silently beside him, her small fingers clutching the frayed hem of her shirt. You're paying for my mom's medicine?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Her tear-filled eyes radiated gratitude. Brian didn't answer her directly. "How much per box?" he asked flatly, his tone clipped. The pharmacist, clearly impressed by the well-dressed man, stammered out the price. Without hesitation, Brian counted out the payment and handed it over. "How long has she been sick?" he asked, his gaze drifting toward the counter to avoid meeting Mia's eyes. She hesitated, watching the pharmacist gather the medicine. 3 months, she murmured. Her voice was barely audible, heavy with exhaustion and sorrow. At first we managed. But then her words broke, and she wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. Insurance won't cover it. Each box costs more than a month's rent. Brian's face remained impassive as he slipped the change into his pocket, but inside a strange discomfort churned. He couldn't shake the way Mia's haunted eyes followed his every move, as if bracing for him to withdraw his help at any moment. "Where to now?" he asked, his tone softer but still firm. "And don't try anything stupid," he added, his authoritative demeanor returning. Clutching the bag of medicine tightly to her chest, Mia gestured toward the street. "It's close by," she said hurriedly, her urgency palpable. "Mom needs it right away. She wasn't doing well when I left." The short walk to Mia's home felt heavy, each step weighted by an unspoken tension. The building loomed in the distance, its decaying structure a stark reminder of lives worn thin by hardship. The walls, once vibrant, now bore the marks of neglect and time. Mia's gaze darted anxiously as they neared. "This is it," she murmured. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the broken door. "Please don't judge what you see inside." The interior was even more dismal than Brian expected. The small, cramped space was overwhelmed with worn furniture, piles of clutter, and a pervasive scent of mildew mixed with something more troubling. The atmosphere carried an unmistakable weight of sickness and despair. "Where's your mom?" he asked, his voice softening under the oppressive quiet. Mia limped deeper into the house, her desperation mounting. "Mom," she called out, her voice quivering with fear. "Mom, please answer me." The dim light filtering through a cracked window revealed a sight that stopped both of them in their tracks. Melissa Collins lay motionless on the floor, her dark hair spread across the worn carpet. Her skin was pallid, her lips tinged a faint purple. "No, no, no," Mia screamed, rushing forward as the bag of medicine fell from her trembling hands. Mia Collins dropped to her knees beside her mother, her own pain forgotten in the overwhelming wave of fear and desperation. "Mom, please wake up. Wake up," she cried, her trembling voice echoing in the small, dark room. Brian Russell stood frozen in the doorway, his imposing figure overshadowed by the scene before him. For the first time in years, the confident businessman felt utterly lost, unsure of what to do. The sight of Mia's raw panic and the fragile, lifeless form of Melissa Collins on the floor began to erode the hardened indifference he had built over decades. Does she need help?" he managed to ask, his usual commanding voice now rough and uncertain. Mia sobbed uncontrollably, her thin shoulders shaking as she clung to her mother. Tears streamed down her dirty face, falling onto Melissa's pale, unmoving one. Her small hands desperately sought any sign of life. "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking with sorrow. "Don't leave me, Mommy. I got the medicine. I'm here." A faint siren pierced the silence, causing Brian to flinch. His gaze shifted between the woman lying on the floor and the heartbroken girl beside her. For the first time, the weight of his own choices pressed heavily on him, a burden he hadn't realized he carried. "If only I had listened sooner," he thought bitterly. "If only I hadn't wasted so much time on anger and revenge." Snapping out of his paralysis, Brian knelt beside Melissa and pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. His hands trembled as he felt for any sign of life. In the oppressive stillness of the room, time seemed suspended, the 3 lives hanging by a fragile thread. "There's still time," he whispered to himself, pulling out his phone with unsteady hands. "There has to be." Dialing 911, his voice carried an urgency he hadn't felt in years. "I need an ambulance immediately," he told the operator, his tone stripped of its usual coldness. "There's an unconscious woman, barely breathing. Please send help." Minutes later, though it felt like an eternity, the sound of sirens filled the narrow street. Brian rushed outside, waving down the ambulance, his polished shoes sinking into the muddy ground. For once, he didn't care about his appearance. "Over here," he shouted, his voice booming with urgency. "She's not in good shape." The paramedics moved swiftly into the cramped house, their equipment in hand. Their movements were precise as they assessed Melissa's condition. Mia refused to let go of her mother's hand until one of the medics gently guided her aside. "Blood pressure is dangerously low," one paramedic noted, setting up monitoring equipment. "We need to get her to the hospital right away." Without hesitation, Brian stepped forward, lifting Melissa into his arms. Hours earlier, his pristine Italian suit had been a symbol of his power and authority. Now, it was stained with sweat and grime as he carefully placed her on the stretcher. "We're going with her," he declared, his voice firm. "The girl is her daughter." Moments later, the ambulance tore through the city streets, its sirens wailing. Inside, paramedics worked tirelessly over Melissa, while Mia clung to her mother's hand, tears streaming silently down her face. Across from her, Brian sat rigidly, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Please don't die," Mia whispered through her tears. "I promise I'll never take anything again. Just don't leave me." At the hospital, the stretcher raced down the hall, Mia limping to keep up, oblivious to the pain in her knee. Brian followed close behind, his once impeccable suit now rumpled and stained. "Pressure's dropping," one of the doctors called out as they wheeled Melissa into the emergency room. "We need immediate intervention." The heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving Mia and Brian standing in the hallway. Mia pounded her small fists against the doors, her cries echoing in the sterile space. Brian gently placed his hands on her shaking shoulders, his voice unexpectedly tender. "They're doing everything they can," he assured her. "You have to stay strong for your mom." Time passed agonizingly slow in the quiet waiting area. Mia curled into a chair, her tear-streaked face staring at the doors that had swallowed her mother. Brian paced nearby, his polished shoes clicking against the floor in a rhythmic, anxious beat. For the first time, the once dominant businessman felt utterly powerless. "If she doesn't make it," he thought, running a hand through his graying hair, "how will I ever live with myself?" A nurse approached with a first aid kit, insisting on treating Mia's knee. Mia barely noticed the sting of antiseptic as the nurse cleaned the wound. Her mind remained with her mother. Brian watched, guilt gnawing at him as he took in the girl's injuries, a stark reminder of the chase that had brought them here. "I should have trusted her," he thought, the realization heavy. "How much time did I waste, blinded by pride and anger?" The creak of the doors jarred them from their thoughts. A doctor stepped into the corridor, his expression grave as he approached. Mia Collins leapt to her feet, her slight frame trembling under the weight of her fears. She almost stumbled but found her footing just as Brian Russell moved instinctively beside her, positioning himself as if to shield her from the news. "How is she?" they asked simultaneously, their voices tinged with desperation. The doctor's gaze flickered between the disheveled man and the frightened girl. The odd pairing registered briefly in his mind before he refocused, his tone professional yet heavy with caution. "We've stabilized her," he began, each word carefully measured, "but her condition remains critical." Mia clutched Brian's coat tightly, her legs quaking beneath her. Without hesitation, Brian placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, steadying her. The doctor continued, explaining Samantha's condition in medical jargon that seemed incomprehensible to Mia. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "just tell me, will she make it?" The doctor paused, a tense silence filling the space. His hesitation made Brian's chest tighten as he felt Mia trembling beneath his hand. "The next few hours will be critical," the doctor finally replied, his words careful yet firm. "We're doing everything we can." Mia's eyes never left the flurry of nurses and doctors who moved purposefully in and out of the room, carrying equipment and supplies. She refused to sit, her gaze following every shadow and movement. Brian loosened his tie, no longer caring about his once pristine appearance. "How much is it to move her to a private room?" he asked abruptly. "The best one you have." The doctor hesitated, his glance darting between them. He began detailing the cost, his tone serious. The numbers made Mia feel faint, but Brian only nodded, already pulling out his phone. "Do whatever needs to be done," he commanded, his voice steely. "Money is not an issue." The hours blurred into a cacophony of beeping machines and urgent footsteps. Mia stood numbly, her eyes wide with worry, while Brian worked the phone, using every connection and resource to secure the best care for Melissa. "She has to pull through," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. "I can't have this on my conscience." Finally, the lead doctor returned, his exhaustion visible after hours of intense effort. Mia approached him almost mechanically, barely aware of her steps. Brian stood by her side, his hand instinctively finding hers. "Please," she pleaded softly, her voice fragile. "Tell me she'll be okay." The doctor adjusted his glasses, his gaze settling on Mia with a compassion that made Brian's throat tighten. "We've managed to stabilize her," he said, carefully choosing his words. "But I must be honest with you, the delay in treatment has caused severe complications." Mia's small hand gripped Brian's more tightly, her knuckles white. The doctor explained the seriousness of Melissa's condition: organ damage, mounting complications, and lowered odds of recovery. Each word hit Brian like a hammer, each syllable a stark reminder of the precious time lost during his misguided pursuit. Mia's quiet sobs and his own overwhelming guilt filled the silent space. A sudden commotion in the hallway shattered the moment. A police officer strode in, his boots clicking against the polished hospital floor. Brian noticed him first, a chill running through him as the officer's stern gaze settled on Mia. "Not now," Brian thought grimly, rising to his full height. "Not when everything is already falling apart." The officer moved with purpose, his crisp uniform a jarring contrast to Mia's dirt-streaked clothes. "Mia Collins," the officer announced, his voice cutting through the quiet hallway. Instinctively, Brian stepped forward, his body rigid with protective tension. "Officer," he said evenly, his tone measured but firm. "This young girl is facing an unimaginable situation. Her mother is in critical condition." The officer shook his head, unmoved by Brian's plea. "I'm sorry, sir," he replied, his tone formal and unyielding. "But she has a history. This time we can't let it slide." Mia seemed to shrink into herself, her frightened eyes darting between the officer and the closed emergency room doors. The tears she had been holding back began to fall, streaking her grimy cheeks. "Please," she begged, her voice shaking. "My mom, she needs me here." Brian tried everything, offering bail, promising to take responsibility for Mia, but each attempt was met with the officer's procedural detachment. "I can't ignore the law," the officer said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Not even for someone like you." The metallic sound of the handcuffs unlocking startled Mia into action. She jumped to her feet, her small hands gripping Brian's arm with surprising strength. "Don't let them take me," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "I need to know she's okay. My mom, please." The hallway erupted into chaos. Mia's pleas reverberated through the sterile walls as she struggled against the officer's grip. Tears streamed down her face, her cries echoing with the desperation that made Brian's heart ache. The distant sound of an alarm from Melissa's room pierced the air, adding to the turmoil. Mia froze, her face pale as she screamed, "Mom," and fought harder to break free. Brian's hands clenched into fists as he stood caught between protecting Mia and the chaos unraveling before him. Brian Russell's voice thundered through the corridor, startling everyone within earshot. "She's just a terrified kid," he roared, his words laced with frustration and anger. Nearby nurses and patients turned their heads, drawn by the intensity of his plea. "Where is your compassion?" Before the officer could respond, a piercing sound shattered the air. A monitor alarm blared from the emergency room. The doors flew open, and a medical team rushed past, shouting, "Emergency!" Mia Collins's face drained of color as she recognized the room number. "Mom," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. She thrashed against the officer's grip, fighting to break free. "No, please let me go. She needs me." Brian's chest tightened as he watched her struggle, her cries cutting through him like a knife. The officer's grip didn't falter, though a flicker of hesitation passed across his face. Medical staff hurried toward Melissa's room, wheeling carts and shouting urgent instructions. The scene unfolded in chaos, but Brian's focus was split. His eyes darted between the emergency room and Mia being dragged toward the exit. Her voice, frantic and heart-wrenching, echoed through the hallway. "Is this really your duty?" Brian snapped at the officer, bitterness seeping into his tone. Cuffing a child while her mother's dying, his words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Mia's small wrists looked suffocated in the oversized handcuffs. Her scraped knees and tear-streaked face bore the marks of her desperation. Brian took a step forward, his voice softening. "Wait, please," he implored. "Just let her stay until we know more about her mother." His plea was drowned out by the sharp sound of another alarm from the emergency room. A doctor emerged, shouting orders to stabilize Melissa. The fragments of their conversation reached Mia's ears: cardiac arrest, unstable, risk of death. Her struggles intensified, her voice rising to a scream. "No," she cried, her voice filled with raw determination. "Let me stay with her, please." Brian stood helpless, his heart sinking as Mia was dragged farther away. At the same time, Melissa's stretcher rushed toward an ambulance, its monitors beeping urgently as doctors barked instructions. "What have I done?" Brian thought, guilt wrapping around him like a vice. If only I had trusted her sooner. The final image of Mia, her tear-streaked face pressed against the window of the police car, burned itself into his memory. Her hands were bound as she watched the ambulance carrying her mother speed off in the opposite direction. The sirens faded into the distance, mingling with the sound of Mia's sobs. Brian clenched his fists, his voice breaking as he muttered, "I'll make this right, even if it's the last thing I do." The private hospital's sterile brightness contrasted sharply with the chaos of the public ER. Polished floors and quiet hallways replaced the cacophony, but the weight of uncertainty lingered just as heavily. Brian stood outside the ICU, his eyes fixed on Melissa's fragile form behind the glass. The monitors beeped erratically, each sound echoing the frantic rhythm of his own heart. "I can't let her die," he murmured to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. Not after tearing her away from her daughter. Time stretched unbearably as doctors and nurses moved in and out of the room, their expressions grim. Brian's once crisp suit was now wrinkled and stained, his tie discarded somewhere along the way. Exhaustion etched lines deep into his face. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from his office flooding in, but he ignored them all. Contracts, he scoffed bitterly, declining yet another call. What good are deals when a life hangs in the balance? A lead doctor approached, clutching a stack of results. His hesitant steps and furrowed brow hinted at the gravity of the situation. Brian felt a pit forming in his stomach as the doctor began to speak, his words slow and deliberate. "We're running out of options," the doctor admitted, his tone heavy with the burden of responsibility. Brian cut him off, his voice sharp. "We need someone who can turn this around. Who's the top specialist in the country for this?" Without waiting for a reply, he began dialing numbers, his hands trembling. He made calls he never imagined he'd have to make, using every ounce of influence and resource at his disposal. "I don't care what it costs," he repeated firmly, time and again. "Get them here now." As the hours dragged on, Brian's gaze rarely left Melissa's pale, unmoving form. Each irregular beep of the monitors drilled into him the fragility of the moment. He paced the pristine floor, his polished shoes scuffing against the tiles, a far cry from his usual composed demeanor. For the first time, the immense wealth and power he'd amassed felt utterly hollow. "What's the point of all this?" he thought, his frustration mounting, "if I can't even save a life?" The arrival of the specialist stirred a ripple of hope. The doctor, known for his brilliance, was greeted with reverence and urgency by the hospital staff. As he reviewed Melissa's case, his expression remained focused, though hints of concern flickered in his eyes. Brian stood by the ICU door, his eyes darting between the specialist and Melissa. Each test, each piece of data, felt like an eternity. "She has to pull through," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have to bring good news to Mia." The next several hours unfolded in an unrelenting sequence of specialized tests and treatments. The specialist worked with steadfast focus, ordering examinations Brian Russell had never even heard of. Each result was scrutinized with unwavering precision, leaving no detail overlooked. "There's something we're missing," the doctor murmured, almost to himself. Brian stood nearby, watching every subtle movement of the specialist, his own eyes searching for a glimmer of hope in the man's expression. The other doctors monitored Melissa Collins's condition with equal intensity, their faces etched with grave seriousness. Around them, the machines emitted a rhythmic, grim soundtrack, marking the passage of time like a relentless metronome. "How much longer must we wait?" Brian asked, his voice betraying the unease he usually kept hidden. "Is there anything we can do?" The specialist looked up, his face drawn with concern. The sight sent a chill through Brian. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught him to read people, and the doctor's tense demeanor was deeply unsettling. Holding a set of trembling papers, the specialist walked over. His typically calm gaze was shadowed by something ominous. "In my 30 years of practice," he began, carefully choosing his words, "I've never encountered a symptom pattern like this." Brian's stomach churned. He leaned against the wall, his legs threatening to buckle under the weight of the doctor's words. The specialist continued, his tone heavy and deliberate. "There's an unexpected complication," he explained, holding up the test results. "It's something our usual procedures didn't account for." The hallway seemed to chill, as though a cold wind had swept through. "How much time?" Brian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The words sounded foreign, even to himself. "How long does she have?" The specialist adjusted his glasses, a motion that felt more like a delaying tactic than necessity. "It's not really about time," he said finally, his tone carrying a gravity that made the air in the room feel heavier. "It's about what we're facing in the background." Meanwhile, Mia Collins was being led through the sterile, echoing hallways of the police station. Her small wrists were bound in handcuffs that felt unbearably heavy. The dried trails of tears on her face reflected her exhaustion, yet a spark of determination still burned in her wide, anxious eyes. The officers guiding her ignored her broken voice. "Please," she rasped, her throat raw from crying. "Can someone just call the hospital? I need to know about my mom." The booking process felt endless and cruel. Each question, every photograph taken, and the slow, deliberate process of fingerprinting chipped away at the precious time she longed to spend at her mother's side. The harsh fluorescent light stung her eyes, but nothing stung more than the tears she struggled to hold back. One call she whispered hoarsely to each passing officer, "I just need to know if she's okay," but no one acknowledged her plea. The holding cell was cold and unwelcoming, with its concrete bench pressed against a wall and a tiny, barred window near the ceiling. Mia sat quietly, her thoughts consumed by Melissa. "Stay strong for her," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "You have to." Back in the hospital, Melissa stirred restlessly in her bed. Feverish heat radiated from her as she mumbled disjointed fragments of thoughts. From the doorway, Brian watched the scene unfold, his body taut with tension. "How will I work like this?" Melissa asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "How will I take care of my daughter?" "Miss Melissa," Brian said softly, stepping closer. "I promise you won't need to worry about that." Before Melissa could respond, her fragmented speech grew more frantic. Her pale cheeks turned crimson as her heart monitor began beeping wildly. Beads of sweat formed on her brow, and she murmured incoherent phrases about black-winged angels dancing above her. "Temperature's rising fast," a nurse called out urgently. "Her fever is spiking." Mia's voice echoed in her memory, even though she was absent. In the present, Jenny instinctively stepped back in alarm. Why is she talking like that? She would have cried if present. The room erupted in chaos. Melissa's words swung from clear statements to fevered delirium. She described stairways to heaven and frozen butterflies landing on her immobile legs. The specialist's expression shifted slightly, a faint glimmer of optimism appearing amidst the concern. "Why are you smiling?" Brian demanded, his sharp eyes catching the subtle change in the doctor's face. "This fever," the specialist replied, "might be exactly what we needed." As the medical team worked to stabilize Melissa, the specialist explained his reasoning. "It could mean her immune system is actively responding to the treatment," he said. "It's like a battle within her body." Brian processed the words as though they were lifelines. Melissa's suffering, though unbearable to witness, might signify a turning point. "Her body's army is fighting back," the specialist continued, glancing at the monitors. "Now, we need to support her as much as we can." In a different part of the city, Mia clung desperately to hope, unaware that her mother's fever could be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. As Melissa's fever surged, her hallucinations grew more vivid. She sang haunting lullabies, reached toward unseen figures, and called out for her parents, long departed. "Don't leave me," she cried, twisting in the bed, her face contorted with distress. "The snakes, they're squeezing me," she whispered feverishly, her voice trembling as though she were locked in another realm. Mia, her small hands trembling, tried to push through to her mother. "I have to help her," she pleaded, but Brian held her back firmly, his expression a mix of worry and restraint. A nurse hurried into the room, clutching the latest blood test results. The specialist crossed the room with swift urgency, scanning the paper with an increasingly grim expression. "What now?" Brian asked, his voice low and weighted with dread. "I need lab confirmation," the doctor replied evasively, already heading toward the door. Meanwhile, Melissa's fevered mumbling mirrored the frantic rhythm of the monitors. She spoke of fiery flowers sprouting from her paralyzed legs, their burning petals leaving no visible mark but searing her nonetheless. Hours dragged by before the fever began to ease. The once frantic monitors recorded a steady drop in Melissa's temperature. Temperatures dropping, the nurse confirmed, her tone a mix of relief and caution. Finally back to normal. As soft daylight filtered through the blinds, Melissa's eyes fluttered open. Gone was the fever's wild, unfocused gaze, replaced by clarity and awareness. Mia leaned over her, her face alight with hope and relief. Brian stood nearby, his presence steady yet hesitant, as though afraid to break the fragile calm. "How are you feeling?" the specialist asked, his voice calm but inquisitive, as he shone a small light into Melissa's eyes. "Different," she replied, her voice raspy and uncertain. "There's something strange in my legs." The room grew tense as the specialist began sensitivity tests. Suddenly, Melissa gasped, her face streaked with tears. I felt that, she exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Doctor, I felt it." Each restored sensation brought new tears and tentative smiles. Hope, though cautious, began to fill the room. The specialist scribbled furiously in his notes, his excitement barely concealed. "The experimental treatment," he murmured. "It seems the fever amplified its effect." "Does this mean she'll walk again?" Mia asked, her voice bright with unrestrained hope. Encouraged by the newfound sensations, Melissa attempted to move. Yet her muscles faltered and frustration clouded her features. Though she could feel the touch, her legs refused to respond fully. "Why can't I move properly?" she asked, her voice edged with despair. "Stay calm," the specialist advised gently. "Regaining sensation is the first step. This will take time." A team of physiotherapists soon arrived, assessing her progress with measured precision. "It's like a map," the lead therapist explained, pointing to her notes. "Some areas are returning, but others still need time to heal." "How much time?" Brian finally voiced the question that hung heavily in the room. His voice was steady, but carried a thread of urgency. Melissa's determination ignited. "I'm not waiting," she declared. With the therapist's help, she managed to sit up, sweat beading on her brow as her legs quivered under the strain. Her muscles burned, but her resolve was fierce. "I can't stop now," she muttered, her jaw tight with effort. "I have to keep going." Mia, watching from the corner, stepped forward, her worry etched on her young face. "Mom, please don't push yourself too hard," she pleaded softly. "Take it easy," the physiotherapist urged, her voice steady but firm. Still, Melissa insisted on testing her weight. despite her legs trembling like fragile reeds. Brian and the therapist steadied her carefully. For a fleeting moment she stood, but just as quickly her knees gave way. Brian reacted instantly, catching her in his strong arms. "I've got you," he said, his voice reassuring. "I won't let you fall." Though relieved, Melissa was inconsolable, whispering through her tears, "But I need to do this." The medical team crafted a careful recovery program. Each tiny victory a slight movement, a firmer grip was met with celebration. Mia remained her mother's fiercest cheerleader, encouraging her through every grueling session. "It's like learning to walk all over again," one therapist explained. "Every small step matters." "But I'll get there, right?" Melissa asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion but still hopeful. As evaluations continued, Brian stepped out of the hospital to arrange for specialized therapy equipment. When he returned, he found Melissa resting while Mia animatedly shared future plans with a nurse. "She's as tough as you," Brian murmured to Mia, his voice low but certain. "She'll make it," Mia replied, her eyes shining with determination. "She never gives up." When Brian's sleek car pulled into the narrow, worn streets of Mia's neighborhood, the sight of their building sent a chill through both of them. The front door was blocked by heavy wooden planks. A glaring eviction notice was nailed at the center. "No," Mia whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped closer. "This can't be happening." Her legs felt like lead, her hands shaking as she clutched Brian's arm. "We'll figure this out," Brian assured her softly, though his own heart sank at the sight. "I promise." "Take it easy, sweetheart," Brian Russell said gently, his voice calm as he tried to ease Mia's panic. But Mia darted toward the entrance, her urgency overpowering her fear. The wooden boards nailed across the doorway were loosely attached, leaving a narrow gap. With some effort, Mia squeezed through. Brian followed, his larger frame struggling to fit into the small space. Inside, the building was eerily silent, a hollow echo of the home it once was. Shadows hung heavy in the air, amplifying the desolation. As they climbed the stairs, eviction notices plastered every wall, their dates stark reminders of the day Mia and Melissa rushed to the hospital. "Our things," Mia whispered, her voice trembling as her fingers reached for the apartment door. The weight of grief broke through as she collapsed into tears. "How can I tell her?" Her voice cracked with sorrow, each word choked with despair. "Let me take a look," Brian said quietly, moving past her to carefully examine the papers. The apartment inside was frozen in time, exactly as they had left it. Dishes sat dirty in the sink, a half-empty coffee cup rested on the table, and Melissa's medications lay scattered across the worn surface. Mia hurried into the small bedroom she'd shared with her mother, only to find more eviction notices strewn across the unmade beds. She sank to the floor, her sobs filling the emptiness around her. Clutching an empty pill bottle, she cried, "I tried so hard. I sold candy. I sold anything I could. And when I couldn't, I took just enough for Mom's medicine. But it wasn't enough. The rent was too much." Brian knelt beside her, his gaze scanning the bills and receipts scattered in a worn shoebox beneath the bed. A knot tightened in his stomach as the sheer cost of the medications became clear. "How can I tell her this?" Mia asked, curling into herself as she hugged her knees. Her voice was small and broken, brimming with despair. "You don't have to tell her right now," Brian said firmly. His voice carried a quiet determination. "Let me handle this." Back at the hospital, Melissa Collins was sitting upright for the first time since her illness had taken its toll. Her legs dangled off the edge of the bed, weak but alive with new energy. "My love," she whispered softly, her arms outstretched toward Mia. "Stay right there," Melissa said, her smile wide and filled with light. Tears streaming down her cheeks, Mia froze in the doorway, her emotions overwhelming her. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. Melissa's first steps were hesitant, her body swaying like a child learning to walk for the first time. She leaned heavily on the bed for balance, each inch forward a monumental effort. Yet, with every step, her movements grew stronger, her confidence more visible. "You're doing it," Mom, Mia cheered, unable to contain her excitement. "Yes, sweetheart," Melissa replied, her own voice filled with emotion. "I'm coming back to you." When Melissa finally reached her daughter, they embraced fiercely, holding each other as tears streamed freely. "My brave little girl," Melissa whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "You gave me the strength to return." Nearby, the specialist observed the scene with quiet reverence. "We'll need to run a few more tests," he said gently, "but I've never seen such a remarkable recovery." Brian, standing close by, felt a lump rise in his throat. He stepped forward, his tone unusually tender. "Melissa," he began, "I have an idea for you both." Melissa turned her gaze toward him, her eyes cautious yet curious. "My house is too big for just me," Brian explained, a kind smile softening his typically serious face. "I'd like you both to come live there with me." Mia's heart soared, the looming worry of eviction momentarily lifting. "Please, Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please say yes." Melissa's expression shifted, disbelief mixing with gratitude. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice low and edged with uncertainty. "Because your daughter taught me about a kind of love and courage I've never known before," Brian replied earnestly, "and because I promised to take care of you both." Tears welled in Melissa's eyes, and her voice trembled as she asked, "Are you sure?" "I'm certain," Brian said solemnly. "It's time for all of us to start fresh." The day Melissa was discharged from the hospital felt like the first breath of spring after a harsh winter. Dressed in fresh clothes Brian had provided, she walked down the corridor with steady, determined steps. Mia skipped happily beside her, her excitement radiating from every movement. Brian followed behind with a quiet smile, his expression carrying unspoken relief and contentment. At the hospital's entrance, the doctor, finishing his final instructions, paused to shake Melissa's hand. "This is a case I'll never forget," he said warmly. "You've redefined what's possible in recovery." As they approached Brian's sleek black car, it no longer seemed to Mia like a symbol of power and wealth or a reminder of her past mistakes. Instead, it represented a new beginning, a bridge to a future she'd never dared to imagine. "Ready to see your new home?" Brian asked, catching Melissa's gaze in the rearview mirror. Beyond the towering iron gates, Brian's mansion came into view. The sprawling gardens, vibrant with swaying flowers, took Mia's breath away. "It's like a dream," she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. Melissa Collins held her daughter's hand tightly, her breath catching as she took in the breathtaking sight of the place they'd now call home. "It's like a real castle," Mia whispered, her wide eyes brimming with wonder. At the grand entrance, Melissa hesitated, her gaze lingering on the gleaming marble floors and the sweeping staircase that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Sensing her unease, Brian Russell rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This place has been empty for too long," he said gently. "It needed life, a family. It needed you." As they explored the house, Mia darted excitedly from room to room, her giggles echoing through the vast halls. Brian had prepared a special room just for her, painted in soft pastel tones and lined with a small bookshelf filled with stories waiting to be discovered. "I wanted to be part of every detail," Brian explained with a warm smile as he watched Mia take in her new space with wide-eyed excitement. Melissa's room, a spacious suite overlooking the lush garden, was equally thoughtful. The calming tones and elegant furnishings reflected a quiet serenity. Through a small adjoining door lay a private office, fully equipped for her physical therapy sessions. "I've thought of everything," Brian said, showing her the specialized equipment. "I want you to have everything you need to recover comfortably." Dinner that evening in the elegant dining room felt both surreal and heartwarming. Brian observed as Mia, with endearing determination, tried to mimic his polished table manners. Melissa guided her gently, her touch filled with love. Watching them, Brian felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a feeling of belonging he hadn't known in years. It's incredible, he thought, how much life can change in just a few days. After dinner, Brian led them to the back garden, where a vine-covered pergola stood bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The sunset painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, casting a serene light over the space. It was the perfect setting for what he had to say. Mia, Brian began, his voice heavy with emotion. There's something important I need to tell you. His words came slowly, each one carrying the weight of his transformation. The successful businessman, once consumed by ambition and status, now spoke with a vulnerability that felt unfamiliar but freeing. Mia, when you tried to steal from me that day, I was a different man, he admitted. To me, you were just a desperate kid, a petty thief, who deserved nothing but scorn. I was wrong, he paused, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that made her heart ache. In that dim alley, you showed me a kind of courage I'd long forgotten. It wasn't the kind that comes from wealth or power, but a bravery born of pure, selfless love. He drew a deep breath and continued, there you were, a child with so little, willing to face anything to save your mother. And there I was, a man with everything, living a hollow life devoid of purpose. Your tears that day weren't for yourself. They were for her. They forced me to see what truly mattered. Brian's voice softened, his tone laced with gratitude. My old ideas of success, money, status, control, they all feel empty now. You taught me that true wealth lies in the relationships we build, the love we nurture, and the resilience we find in the darkest moments. Watching your mother fight for her life made me realize that all the riches in the world mean nothing if I can't use them to make a difference. He looked at Melissa and Mia, his voice trembling slightly. Mia, you stole more than my wallet that day. You stole my heart. And with it you stripped away my arrogance, my pride, and my blindness. In their place, you gave me a new purpose, a new family, and a chance to build something real. Tears streamed down Melissa and Mia's faces as his words settled over them. Slowly, Mia stood, her small frame trembling with emotion, and wrapped her arms tightly around Brian. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Thank you for standing by us. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, but the garden remained aglow with the warm light of lanterns dotting the pathways. Brian reached out to help Melissa to her feet, pleased to see her moving with greater ease. Well, he said, a genuine grin spreading across his face, I think it's time you see the winter garden. Melissa, I think you'll love it. There's plenty of room for a true flower haven. Mia clung to Melissa's hand on one side and Brian's on the other. Together they strolled through the softly lit garden, the night air filled with the chirping of crickets and the faint scent of blooming flowers. Brian looked up at the sparkling sky, his heart full as he mused aloud, sometimes we have to feel completely lost before we can find the path we were always meant to take. Melissa glanced at her daughter, then at Brian, her heart swelling with gratitude. In that moment, she knew this was more than a house. It was a home, a place where they could start anew, together. The chirping of crickets and the sweet fragrance of night-blooming flowers surrounded them as they strolled toward the winter garden. Melissa glanced at her daughter, now beaming with happiness, and then at Brian, the man who had unexpectedly transformed their lives. Life truly is full of surprises, she thought, giving a gentle squeeze to the hands of her newfound family. You know, Brian said, pausing to gaze at the rising moon, I'm beginning to think it wasn't me who saved you. It was you who saved me. The days after Melissa and Mia moved into Brian's mansion were a mix of challenges and discoveries, punctuated by moments of profound joy. The once quiet, imposing house now brimmed with laughter and a sense of connection that had been missing for far too long. Mom, look. I planted the first daisy seeds just like we planned, Mia exclaimed, her small hands dusted with soil as she proudly displayed the freshly prepared flower bed. Melissa's face lit up, her heart swelling with gratitude and joy. It was hard to believe that just weeks ago, she couldn't imagine her daughter looking this carefree and happy. You're doing amazing, my little flower, Melissa said with a warm smile. This garden will be the most beautiful we've ever had. Brian approached, watching the scene with a quiet, contented smile. Mia, you really have a talent for this, he said, his tone brimming with affection. Pretty soon we might need even more space for all the flowers you'll be planting. Do you really think so? Mia asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Because I was already thinking of planting sunflowers by the gate. That's a fantastic idea, Brian replied with a soft laugh. It struck him how natural it felt to laugh again, a sound that seemed both familiar and completely new. One sunny afternoon, the three of them worked together to build a tree swing. "Hang on tight," Brian said with a playful grin. "I'll test it out first." "Will it break?" Mia asked, her laughter mixing with a hint of concern. "If it does, I'll make an even better one," Brian promised. He eased onto the swing and gave it a gentle push, relieved when it held steady. Soon, Mia was soaring high into the air as Melissa stood behind her, giving gentle pushes. It was a simple moment, yet so perfect, that Brian felt a warm tug in his heart, a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Later that evening, Mia's excitement filled the dining room as she shared ideas for the house and garden. "We could paint a mural with flowers and animals on the entrance wall. What do you think?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with creativity. Melissa glanced at Brian, who nodded enthusiastically. "I think it's a wonderful idea, my little artist," he said. "Tomorrow we can start planning it together." "Yes, it'll be the most beautiful mural ever," Mia exclaimed, her joy lighting up the room. Melissa reached across the table, her hand resting on Brian's. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Brian returned her gaze, feeling a warmth that spread through his chest. "There's no need to thank me," he replied. "You both brought light back into my life." As weeks turned into months, Brian's mansion transformed. The once silent halls now echoed with dreams, laughter, and the unfolding story of a family finding its way back to joy. Melissa often paused to look at her daughter and Brian, her heart full. This is only the beginning, she thought, feeling a deep sense of contentment. With her recovery complete, Melissa threw herself into community projects and social causes, working alongside Brian and Mia to give back. The hardships they had endured inspired her to help others find hope. She organized fundraisers and support programs for struggling families, her genuine warmth drawing people in and making each event a success. Brian, too, experienced a profound change. With Mia as his partner, he launched the New Chance Foundation, an initiative that provided shelter, education, and meals for children in need. The foundation grew rapidly, gaining support from friends and colleagues alike. "Mr. Russell, 3 new children arrived at the shelter today," a coordinator informed him during a visit. "Excellent," Brian replied, pride evident in his voice. "Let's make sure they have everything they need." Mia quickly became a leader within the foundation, her compassion shining as she greeted each new child with a warmth that reflected her own journey. Melissa often watched her daughter from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. Melissa's role within New Chance expanded as well. She organized activities, guided children with care and encouragement, and inspired them with her words. "You can achieve anything you set your heart on," she told the kids at a meeting. "Believe in yourselves and work hard. I'll be here to help you every step of the way." The mansion had become more than just a home. It was now a haven of hope and love, a place where new beginnings flourished. With every flower they planted, every meal they shared, and every child they helped, their bond deepened. Together, they proved that from the darkest moments, something beautiful and enduring could grow. Brian's routine shifted too. He traded lengthy boardroom meetings and lavish business dinners for afternoons spent at shelters and local events. The reputation he once carried rooted in wealth and status began to evolve, now echoing with compassion and generosity. "I never thought I'd see this day," Brian admitted to an old friend during a charity event. "Mia and Melissa changed my entire outlook on life," his friend smiled warmly. "And because of that, Brian, you've changed so many lives in return." The mansion, once a stark symbol of wealth, had transformed into a home filled with warmth and love. Its grand walls now reverberated with the laughter of visiting children, who joined reading afternoons and shared meals lovingly hosted by Melissa. Mia often took the lead during tours of the estate, eagerly sharing how her life had changed. "You wouldn't believe how it used to be," she'd say, her smile radiant. "Now, This place is more than a mansion, it's truly home. On quiet evenings, the family often gathered under the stars in the sprawling garden. As the cool breeze rustled through the trees, their connection deepened with every shared moment. "Do you think we can do more?" Mia asked one night, her bright eyes filled with hopeful determination. Brian exchanged a glance with Melissa, their bond unspoken yet profound. "Always, sweetheart," he replied. "And we'll do it together." Melissa squeezed their hands, her smile soft and confident. "There's nothing we can't accomplish when we stand together," she said. The New Chance Foundation flourished, and its success brought Brian invitations to speak at conferences. At one event, he stood before a captivated audience and shared his journey of transformation. "It's not wealth that defines a person," he said, his voice steady and heartfelt. "It's the way they use what they have to make the world a better place." Melissa also began sharing her story, her resilience resonating deeply with listeners. "Even in life's darkest moments," she said during a panel discussion, "there's always a light that can guide us. Often that light is found in the people we choose to love and support." From a distance, the joyful voices of children echoed, singing songs of hope and resilience, a promise of brighter tomorrows. The family's journey, marked by struggles, perseverance, and triumph, became a beacon of hope for others. As they reflected on their incredible story, Brian addressed their growing community with gratitude and optimism. "We hope this story washes away your fatigue and ignites a flame of hope within you," he said. "Share your thoughts with us, and let's create a strong, enduring community where everyone feels connected and supported." Melissa added with a kind smile, "Life's challenges can be overwhelming, but together we can build something beautiful. Your stories and voices matter, and we want to hear them." Finally, Brian looked toward the horizon, a smile of confidence on his face. "Don't miss the incredible stories we're bringing to you soon," he said. "We're here to share selections full of depth, meaning, and hope. See you there." This story has truly been a journey of transformation, filled with hope, love, and second chances. It began with a desperate young girl named Mia and her mother, Melissa, who fought against overwhelming odds just to survive. But through their struggles, they found unexpected help in Brian, a wealthy businessman who, at first, was hardened by his success and indifference. Through their bond, Brian learned that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the relationships we build and the love we share. From the cold walls of Brian's mansion to the warm home they've now built together, the story has shown us that no matter how dark the past, there is always a light guiding us toward a brighter future. As Mia planted her first daisy seeds in the garden, and as Melissa began her recovery, we witnessed a family coming together against all odds, proving that even the most fractured lives can be healed with compassion and understanding. We invite you to share this incredible story with those who need a little inspiration and hope in their lives. If you found something meaningful in this journey, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your loved ones. Your support helps us reach even more people who can benefit from these stories of resilience. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. How did it impact you? What did you find most moving about Mia, Melissa, and Brian's journey? Leave your feelings and comments below, and let's continue to build a community of support and love. Together, we can make a difference.